Hi, Govan, and welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and one of the things that Tolkien talks about in his essay, or at the time, lecture that he gave on Faerie Stories, is the fact that fantasy gives us what he called the consolation of the good ending. Now, I'm not really going to talk about his comments in that essay here, but I do want to examine how he treats the consolation of the good ending in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because it's really kind of interesting in that he kind of tells us within those stories themselves, and especially The Lord of the Rings, that the kind of ending you might expect is they lived happily ever after to the end of their days. And I'll get into that in a minute. And yet that's not really the ending we get in either case. So let's take a look at his comments, indirect comments within the stories, and then let's take a look at the actual endings themselves, and particularly the ending of The Lord of the Rings, and kind of take a look at what it means. So the reason this topic is somewhat ironic is because Bilbo in The Lord of the Rings actually tells us a couple of times how he would like to end his book. And by his book, of course, he means The Hobbit, There and Back Again, the story of his adventure with Thorin and company. And those two instances, one is actually in the Council of Elrond, and one is after the Council of Elrond when he's talking to some of the other hobbits. And in the Council of Elrond, he basically says, he actually volunteers in the book, not in the movie, but he basically volunteers to take the ring to Mount Doom, saying, probably somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that everybody seems to be leading up to the idea that Bilbo's the one who started this, and so Bilbo's the one who should finish it. And he complains that, I had thought up an ending for my book, which doesn't look likely to come true, which is he lived happily ever after to the end of his days. And he said, I'll probably have to rewrite that now. Gandalf, of course, says, calm down, Bilbo. You're not taking the ring. You're too old, and it's passed on. But, we get this glimpse of Bilbo thinking of putting this ending to his book. And in the movie, we see the same thing, but in a conversation with Gandalf in the Shire. After the Council of Elrond, while the Elrond and others are trying to decide who is going to be in the Fellowship, Bilbo again kind of repeats this same thing. He's talking to Frodo, and I think Merry, Pippin, and Sam are also present. And he mentions the idea that they're going to have to write a new book based on Frodo's adventure, and Frodo basically says it looks like all the possible endings are dark and ugly. And he says, well, you should have a good ending to a book. What about they all, settled down together and lived happily ever after to the end of their days? So you get that same thing. And interestingly enough, in the Council of Elrond, he even, this is probably Tolkien kind of poking fun a little bit, but Bilbo says, it's a good ending and none the worse for having been used before. So he's already kind of alluding to the fact that this is a typical ending, even as far back as this mythical prehistory that we're talking about in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Now, of course, we don't get either of those. We don't get that ending in either of The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, rather famously, and to the disappointment of many readers, and even my disappointment the first time I read it, sort of disappointment. I'll get to that in a minute. Basically, after Sam returns from seeing Frodo off at the Grey Havens, he comes home to Rosie and his children, and in the movie they kind of do it a little bit different, but in the book he comes home, dinner's ready, he sits down at the table, Rosie hands him one of his daughters, and he says, well, I'm back. And that's just the last words of the book. In The Hobbit, what we get is kind of an afterword where we see Bilbo back in the Shire, Gandalf and Balin visit him, and they're kind of having a conversation and about what's going on at the Lonely Mountain. And Bilbo says, well, it seems like everything, has come true according to the prophecies. And Gandalf basically says, what did you expect? I mean, did you think that you were, just that all the things that happened to you were just a matter of sheer luck, and that, this is all for your sole benefit? He says, you're a very fine fellow, Mr. Baggins, and I'm very fond of you, but you are, after all, just a small person in a wide world. And Bilbo Baggins says, thank goodness. And that's pretty much the end of The Hobbit. So again, we don't really get a he lived happily ever to the end of his days ending there either. So anyway, let's take a look at both of those endings, why they kind of matter for Tolkien's view of what the happy ending is about, and see what we can come up with. Of the two endings, of course, The Hobbit is a lot closer to Happily Ever After than The Lord of the Rings. And the reason for that is we've kind of already put behind the bittersweet elements of the ending with Thorin dying and Bilbo learning that Fili and Kili had also died in the battle. And we see him settle down in the Shire. He's enjoying life now. And, basically what we see with Gandalf and Malin is it really is kind of an epilogue type scene. It's not the same thing, but it's an important scene. And it's one that really had to be added in. And the reason for that I'll explain in the next section, but for now let's just kind of put things in context. Bilbo is happy in the Shire, and he's talking to Gandalf about these, bigger picture topics. And the bigger picture topics involve the prophecies that, were earlier made about the dwarves returning to Erebor and all that sort of thing. And Gandalf, makes a point of saying, you don't disbelieve the prophecies just because you were involved, do you? And so it's kind of situating Bilbo in this bigger world. And not just a bigger world, but a bigger scheme would be, I guess, a way to put it. So the ending here is definitely not just saying, and he lived happily ever after. It serves as a reminder that the story is probably a little bit bigger than just Bilbo's own personal adventure. And of course, the other thing is we do have the bittersweet elements. We don't, the ending is not that far removed from the fact that Thorin had just died. Bilbo was, very saddened by that fact. And of course, there were a lot of other very sad things that happened as a result of the Battle of the Five Armies. Out of that sadness came a lot of good. You finally get more cooperation between the elves and the dwarves and the men of Dale. But overall, the ending is not just, everything turned out great, because you do have a lot of people who died and that sort of thing. So then, of course, you have the journey back to the Shire, which is kind of a reminder of all of the journey that Bilbo took in the earlier stages of the book. So I mean, you've got that as well, even though it's of course told in a much quicker fashion because adventures didn't happen on the way back quite so much. The ending in The Lord of the Rings is of course a lot less like a happily ever after story. And part of that is because Frodo, to the extent that he is the protagonist, doesn't really have just the happy ending. In fact, it's precisely because he can't have that happy ending that he has to leave for the Grey Havens. To the extent that Sam is the protagonist, it's still not entirely a happy ending because his idea of a happy ending was that Frodo was also going to be able to settle down and enjoy the Shire after having saved it. So we don't see a perfectly happy ending here. And that again is kind of Tolkien reminding us, there's real life. It's, happy endings are rarely better than bittersweet, at least to some degree. But you've got some really interesting differences between this ending and most happy endings, precisely because there's a little bit of a confusion between whether Frodo or Sam is even the real protagonist of the story. And I'm going to work on a video on that topic, by the way, so stay tuned for that. But the ending in The Lord of the Rings, they come back, they have to save the Shire from Saruman in the book. That doesn't really happen in the movie, so spoiler alert. And I've done a video on the Scouring of the Shire, by the way. If you haven't read the book but would like to learn about that, you can check that video out. I'll link to that in the description below. So you've got that element of a bittersweetness to it. You, of course, also have other bittersweet elements to it, even though after Boromir dies, nobody in the Fellowship dies. You do have Gimli saying close to the end, before everybody leaves Gondor, I don't think we'll all be gathered together in one place again after this. And he's right. It never happens again. Some of them do meet again from time to time, but you never have the Fellowship reunite as a whole. So you've got that element of the bittersweetness. You've got the fact that, they have to, basically rescue the Shire, which is kind of a problem. And then, of course, Frodo has his problems with, he's got the stab in the shoulder from the Morgul knife on Weathertop, and he's got his wound from Shelob. Both of those continue to bother him for the rest of his life on Middle Earth. And so that's why he eventually takes the ship and leaves. And of course, that's really sad for Merry, Pippin, and Sam, because, they're very good friends with him. They had this huge adventure with him. And as I said, Sam's idea of a happy ending is Frodo being able to settle down just as well as Sam can, but he can't. So you have this ending where it's almost more bitter than sweet. And so that's one of the reasons that when I first read the book, you know, the book was amazing. I mean, it was the best thing I had ever read, still is, and the ending was good, but there was a part of me that kind of rebelled at the ending because it's like, why are we having this really sad ending? And then to top it off, the weirdness of just coming back and Sam saying, "Well, I'm back." It took me forever to figure out, to puzzle about, why that ending. It doesn't make any sense. But I think, having gotten older and a little wiser, I think I finally figured out a little bit of, at least, of what the point of that ending is. So now let's take a look at both of these endings and get an idea of the real significance of both of them for Tolkien in view of his idea of the happy ending. So let's go back a bit and analyze some of the comments that Tolkien makes about stories and endings. As I mentioned, of course, he says in On Faerie Stories that one of the things fantasy gives us is the consolation of a good ending. And he adds a little extra commentary on this in some of his letters and other works. In one of his letters, for instance, he says that basically history is a long defeat with glimpses of final victory, and some of those glimpses are stronger in legends and myths and things like that. Glimpses, of course, because they are never the actual final victory that Tolkien is referring to, which, being a Christian, he's referring to the end of the world. And so you've got the idea of the glimpse of the final victory, and the glimpse of the final victory for Tolkien is never perfectly happy because it's not the final victory. So you do always have some element of bittersweetness to any happy ending, or should, because in the world as we know it, things never turn out perfectly well. And so you've got that element. Another element, like I mentioned before, and this is kind of especially true in The Hobbit, is the idea that you get the broader view a little bit. Tolkien is careful in the Hobbit, through Gandalf, to point out to Bilbo that Bilbo is really a very small player in the bigger scheme of things. And we see a little extra commentary on this theme in The Lord of the Rings, because in The Lord of the Rings we get Frodo and Sam having a conversation about stories in the Two Towers, and they bring up the fact that, the great stories never end. And Sam points out that they're still kind of in the same story as Beren and Luthien from the Silmarillion, because Beren, who got the Silmaril from Morgoth, eventually that Silmaril passed down to his descendant Eärendil, who ended up becoming the Star Eärendil, which is the light that was caught in the Phial of Galadriel, which they're carrying around. So there's this idea that the story never really ends. You just have the end of part of the players. And Frodo mentions this as well. He basically says, our part in the story may come to an end, but the story goes on. And so for Tolkien, the story hasn't really ever ended in any, particular real way. I mean, it's just the particular participant's role may have ended, and thus Bilbo, his part in the story of the Lonely Mountain had ended, but the story of the Lonely Mountain went on in the fulfillment of the prophecies that Gandalf references. And in the same way, Frodo's part in the story had ended, and that's why he left. But you have Sam, who is still part of the story, and we kind of see how that plays out in the appendices, because he eventually raises kids. He and Merry and Pippin kind of are involved in a lot of activity in the Shire, and Merry and Pippin are especially involved in writing down a lot of things that happen, and Sam is responsible for finishing the Red Book, of course. And so you've got a slight continuation of the story in the appendices, and we even see that finally Sam takes ship and sails into the West as well. So, I mean, there's a little bit more of the story that isn't really at the end of The Lord of the Rings that we have to get the appendices for, but it's the same idea. When Sam comes home and he says, well, I'm back, he's back. His story isn't quite over, but for purposes of the story that we're, reading, it's ended. And so his "well, I'm back" phrase is kind of a way of saying I have returned from the overall story element that I've been involved in. And of course, he eventually leaves and goes west, but even so, I mean, that's kind of a separate part of the story. Another thing about the "well, I'm back" thing, this is something that Frodo points out in both the book and the movie. He says, "You cannot always be torn in two. You will have to be one and whole for many years." Frodo didn't really have to be, and that's partially because Frodo was, by the nature of his task and the things that he went through, never going to be whole in Middle Earth. He couldn't be healed completely in Middle Earth, and so that's kind of why he had to leave, at least part of the reason. The other thing is, Frodo didn't really have any obligations to anybody else at that point, whereas Sam had married Rosie, and at that point, even Sam acknowledged that he was torn in two between his love for Frodo and his love for Rosie. And part of the resolution of that was Frodo actually in the book has Sam and Rosie move into Bag End with him before Frodo ends up leaving. This is one of the things that kind of annoyed me about the movie. They show Sam living in his own house slash hobbit hole. It's kind of a odd mix in the movie, but it always annoyed me because one of the important things about the ending was that Sam was kind of the heir of Frodo at the end of it, in that he took over Bag End. He ended up becoming the mayor, which the Bagginses had never been as far as I know, but he kind of ended up being the heir of Frodo in that sense. And the fact that they didn't do that in the movie kind of annoyed me, because it really is kind of important when you think about it, because what Frodo is kind of saying here is you can have both for a time, but sooner or later you're going to actually have to be just Sam, the father and husband. You can't always be servant and friend of Frodo, because at this point in your story you have responsibilities and you're your own man, and I can't be tearing you away from that at this point. And so you get that element in the book, and this is one of the things that I missed when I was a lot younger, because being a teenager, you don't really understand that stuff as well. And in listening to and reading other commentary, I've kind of picked up on it more over time. Sam is really becoming his own person by the end of the book, whereas even though he takes a much more active role towards the end of the story than in the beginning, he is still always, in some sense, an attachment to Frodo. And so the ending is, well, I'm back. He's back as a whole person. He's going to be Sam as himself, as the husband of Rosie and the father of his children, doing his own thing. He is no longer split in his mind about what his duties are and what he's supposed to do. So that's a huge part of what that ending is really about, I think. And of course, again, it situates us within the bigger frame. We don't get a proper "and they all lived happily ever after," because they don't just live happily ever after. The story does go on. There are other things that happen. Merry and Pippin eventually go back, visit Éomer before he dies, and then die in Gondor. And we get, other things in the appendices that kind of show the story is going on, and it's not a perfectly happy, people die of old age. It's not, the happily ever after ending kind of leaves out the fact that everybody does die. So you don't, the happily ever after until the end of his days part of what Bilbo says is actually important, because most of the time you don't get until the end of his days. It's just ever after. And of course, the implied meaning of that is until they died of natural causes or something. But technically, the words mean they just live forever. And so Bilbo's little twist on that ending is important, and we get to see that twist carry out in the appendices. And the broader point is, you have this bigger world that continues to go on, and the story as a whole continues to go on, but Sam is basically no longer a part of that story. And the people that we see are no longer part of the story in the same way that they were before. So again, it's kind of leaving us sort of hanging in a way because it's trying to remind us things continue. There's other things to do. There's more, and in the appendices, one of the things we learn is Aragorn and Eomer spend a lot of their time uh, killing off more orcs and trying to bring order to Middle Earth in their own kingdoms because the job isn't completely done. But the story is focused on the Hobbit's perspective, and so when Frodo sails west and Sam comes home, they're part of that overall saga. It's done, but we still are left with the idea that it's not just they lived happily ever after and everything turned out well. It's not quite that simple ever in Tolkien's mind. And so he's reminding us of that with this ending, but also tying up that loose end of Sam being torn in two in his mind. So that's kind of my take on the Lord of the Rings ending. And there's probably more you could say about it, but it's one of those things that I've always wanted to really explore more because it really did, when I first read it, there was a part of my mind that knew that it worked, but there was a part of my mind that, because it's so used to the happily ever after, was a little bit taken aback and shocked and like, why does it end like this? So again, with a little age and a little wisdom, you do kind of appreciate it more. And I hope this explained it a little bit for anybody else out there who might also be having some of those same thoughts. So that's my take on the happy endings in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and the rather interesting irony that Bilbo basically tells us that we're going to get a happily ever after, and yet we don't. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you found it instructive. If you have any other comments or anything about the endings that you think might add to this discussion, please do leave them in the comments. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, share it around. If you want to learn more about Tolkien and the worlds he created, then please do subscribe to the channel. And also you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.